and welcome to Counterculture. I'm Peter Whittle. Now, before we talk about this week's subject, just a reminder, please do subscribe, won't you? It's very simple, it's free. You just go to the subscribe button on our channel, and then next door to it there's a bell sign, and if you click on that you get notifications of all our shows as they come up. So please do. We're on 110,000 subscribers now and 12 million views nearly. But please do add to that, won't you? Now, the subject this week we're talking about is one that many viewers of our channel have asked for a long time. Demographics. You might have already had through this letter recently. It's from the government. It's the Census 2021, obviously, every 10 years. The last one was in 2011. This will tell us a lot about the makeup of Britain when the results come out later this year or early next year. But what actually is the effect of demographics on cultural makeup of the country and also its political makeup? What are the overall effects? What is the lookout for Britain and Europe in particular with changing demographics? And, you know, should we care about it? I know that a lot of you care about it. To discuss these issues, I'm very pleased we have somebody who is a pioneer in this particular area, and that is David Coleman, who is Professor of Demography at Oxford University. Also, Eric Kaufmann, who is Professor of Politics at Birkbeck College, the author of numerous books, including Whiteshift, that he came onto the channel and talked to us about some time ago, and Emma Webb from the Civitas think tank. Thank you very much for joining us. Can I start by asking you, David, do you think, I said there that, you know, many of our viewers say, when are you going to talk about demographics? Do you think this is an untouchable area in the what you might call the popular mainstream?
I don't think it is. There's enough chat about it around the edges of it, and even more centrally, to say that it's not untouchable. It is difficult. Those in academic life who speak about it in anything other than with bended knee, as it were, tend to get a lot of flack. I've had a lot of flack. I imagine Eric must have had quite a bit of flack as well. Perhaps he can tell us about his wartime experiences in a moment. I've had petitions against me which failed, and were not actually in my university taken very seriously, I think.
But what would
I suspect it's done me some harm in terms of preferment, and I know that one or two academics, certainly one in America, refused to appear in any program which featured me. And this is a respectable academic, not some lunatic.
But when you say, I mean, when you say, unless you talk about this on bended knee, what would bended knee be then?
Oh, what I mean is avoiding or certainly tiptoeing around any kind of critical comment or comment that might be regarded as critical about the consequences of ethnic change, about the average behavior of any ethnic group, if it's possible to speak about average behavior, about the reputation of different ethnic groups, about specific problems like to do with integration, to do with alleged higher levels of crime, to do with, as we know, problems of attitudes towards women and girls, particularly poor white girls, as we saw in these scandals in Rochdale and elsewhere, which were covered up wholly or in part in order to avoid giving offence and possibly to avoid the authors of the reports getting a very bad reputation as being racist. The accusation racist has until recently, and perhaps even still, more or less trumped any kind of argument of a more rational kind. Sometimes the accusation is justified, very often it's not, but it serves to shut down discussion.
Yes. Eric, when you wrote Whiteshift, which was actually just looking, so far as I could see from it, it was actually looking at it in a very, very clear and objective way about the differences and what was going to occur for white majority countries as they stand now. What was the reaction, therefore, to your book amongst your peers, in the academic world? Was it one of censure?
Well, I think when you write a book that's got 600 pages in it, that gives you a bit of protection. But I think that broadly, I was pleased with the media response, including the sort of central, the center ground, even things like the Literary Review and the FT and the Los Angeles Review of Books. But it was it was places like the Guardian and Vox where you get this sort of knee-jerk reaction. How can you say anything that's nice about something like white identity or about the desire to slow down ethnic change? How can that be seen as anything other than absolutely horrendous? So you did get that response. But I mean, for example, I was on Ezra Klein's show, which is a sort of quite a long form radio program, and I have to say I was reasonably pleased with the tenor of the questions. But I think here in Britain with the Guardian Review, and there were some, the London Review of Books, there were some attack pieces, but I think that's to be expected. Whenever, as David said, whenever you touch this subject of ethnic change in a way that's not sort of approved, you'll get it from that section of what I call the left modernists. The cultural left will go after you.
I think actually, Eric, you have made the point that in fact, the left, broadly speaking, always welcome the idea of ethnic change because it sort of very much aids and abets their belief in social transformation. Isn't that right?
Yeah, it's a particular strand which is the modernist left, the cultural left. So it's distinct from the old left, which might even be the old labor working class left, which traditionally has been, for example, wanted restricted immigration. In the US, the biggest immigration restrictionist lobbies were like the American Federation of Labor, the Knights of Labor, some of these workers' organizations. But that's kind of really changed starting mid-20th century. The leadership of the unions really began to be drawn into the new left, the sort of cultural turn of the left away from class towards identity categories has really taken hold in organizations, even those that are supposed to be representing the working class. So the left now is defined as the Labor Party, as the Democrats in the US. They're increasingly defined by what Rob Ford would call identity liberals, metropolitan university towns who are concerned with these identity categories and with offenses or the purported offending of these categories and stretching the meaning of terms like racism and transphobia and so on. So that's really where the left increasingly is intellectually, and so they are going to be very hostile to anything that is not completely right on in terms of being on board with cosmopolitanism and ethnic change.
Do you think actually, Emma, that it's actually interesting what Eric says there, because in a way you'd think that with the kind of incredible preponderance now of identity politics in everything, actually people would speak about this quite a lot. Yeah. You do you see what I mean? That you'd think that they actually wouldn't shy away, but in fact, obviously, they are.
Yeah, I think it's a bit, the way I'm going to phrase this is a bit too shallow and doesn't really describe it well enough. But I think that there is a sort of double standard, and people like James Lindsay have pointed to Marcuse's ideas about repressive tolerance, the idea that certain things that are not, as I think Eric would call the new left or left modernism, that anything that isn't that is just simply not tolerated. And so when in discussions around white identity or the white working class, particularly white working class boys, there is a lack of objectivity or a lack of reason when it comes to the way that we talk about these things. And I think that for many of that group, the new left, if we should call them that, I think that for them the facts don't really matter, because it's the narrative, it's entirely based on emotions and feelings and subjectivity, and so there is not only a lack of tolerance on the other on the alternative side of the debate there, where everybody, even if you walk on eggshells, you're still going to fall foul of the discussion. There's no way around that. But there's also almost an intentional blind spot from their perspective, where we can talk about every other identity except the identity that they see as being at the top of the pyramid. So anything that is at the top of that hierarchy, that is not regarded as being an oppressed group, it's not only that you can't discuss it or you can't speak about it favourably, but it's almost as if it doesn't exist at all.
Yes. Do you think that... Can we lay a few sort of facts out on the table, actually? I mean, basically, it seems that, and you please correct me if I'm wrong, I'm being very broad here, that essentially over the next century, white majority, or countries that are white majority at the moment, will cease to be. Is that actually something that is verifiable in as it were, projection and fact, or is that just a political view, Eric?
Well, and David's written on this too as well, but I can let him talk about Britain, but certainly for North America, the US and Canada are meant to lose their white majorities around 2050. Might be slightly later in Canada and then a bit later in Australia, but New Zealand, Canada, US certainly around that time, and then towards the end of the century for Britain. But of course, a key question around when we're talking about ethnic majority, which is a community that is united in a belief in common ancestry, there is a capacity for assimilation through intermarriage. So one of the questions, of course, in the US case is somebody who is part Hispanic and part European in origin. A lot of those people will identify as white, so it's very hard to pinpoint exactly when this point will arrive. So there's a messiness about the definition of these groups, a little bit, certain fuzziness around the edges, but certainly with existing census categories, I would say mid-century for North America, New Zealand, and later in the century for Western Europe. David, I don't know your thoughts on that.
Yes, David, can you come in there?
Certainly. I agree with what Eric has said. I'm reluctant, though, ever to use the word will in the context of a population projection, even though it may seem overwhelmingly obvious that what you say will indeed come to pass, that numerically speaking, white majorities will cease to be majorities sometime in the course of this century or early in the next century. Things do change. Events happen. Brexit and the coronavirus might have an impact on the migration levels, for example, which drive this process. So far it's having an effect mostly on European minorities who count as white. Something else might happen in future which would affect migration from countries where the population does not identify as white. So I think it's overwhelmingly likely, but it certainly isn't certain, and it certainly can't be verified unless you can hire a TARDIS and zip off in the 21st century and see what's going on there. The point you made about what you might call ethnic drift is an important one. It is indeed driven mostly by intermarriage. But it's also a change of identity, comparing some parents and some children. Whether it still operates to the same degree, I don't know. But between the census of 2001 and later, there was a tendency for the children of women who classed themselves as mixed. Their children were often classified by the parents, of course, because they were their only babies at the time, as white British. This trend may reverse if the white British loses its cachet, which it is rather rapidly at the moment. But that has been the trend in the past.
Could you sort of speculate? I'm sure you're about to say you don't like to speculate, but we're having this census now. We'll know about what it reveals maybe later this year, early next year. What, David, would you expect to see from this when it comes to ethnicity for this country? What would your general idea be, do you think, about changes that we might see that this might reveal?
A repeat in a slightly less dramatic way of the shocks which follow the publication of results from the 2011 census. But that is to say, a much more substantial advance of ethnic minority populations in major cities in Britain and also in other places as well. It may not be as substantial, but I don't know. But migration has been proceeding at a very high level of the order of sometimes over 300,000 net per year. I think the average over the last few years has been about 280,000. There was a short time when half of that was from the European Union and half from outside it. Now the balance has shifted, especially since Brexit, where the net migration from the European Union, insofar as we know what migration is nowadays, is much reduced. And that's been more than compensated by an increase from non-white countries. And so it may be the situation has accelerated, and we will see even more interesting shocks than last time, which illustrates, by the way, the inadequacy of a census to keep tabs on population change in a 21st century society. It's quite absurd that we haven't shrugged off the census much earlier and gone over to a population register. But there's, as you know, there's all kinds of reactionary prejudice against population registers in the English-speaking world, and the expense is likely to deter any action in that direction in the foreseeable future.
Eric, I think one of the shocks that maybe David was referring to there, you can tell me if I'm wrong, but was that, for example, in London, my home city, for the first time ever historically, the white British population was 45%. In other words, is that what is known as a minority majority? But it was certainly therefore a minority. But you see, even though we're saying shock, at the same time, it wasn't treated as a shock. It was immediately treated, if I remember, by the media as either something to celebrate or indeed that, well, so what? Should we care? I mean, what would you say is this census will show about London? Do you think? My feeling is probably it will show that the white British population has maybe gone down to the 30s.
Well, I think it's a bit complicated because of when the census is taking place, and a lot of the East European population will have declined. So maybe the white British share might not have gone down much, but I think the white share will have dropped. So the white share also dropped, including white European. That percentage declined, and I think that will be what declines the most in London.
Yes.
But I think I think the bigger question, of course, is the greater if I had to guess, I don't know. It'll be interesting to look at the metropolitan London area, including outside the M25, to see if there are pockets of rapid change outside the M25. Because from the North American experience, we would expect to see something like that occurring. Sort of a suburban ring diversifying is something that we've seen a lot of. The other thing is, of course, this then leads to, it feeds very much into the politics of populism and polarization because, and there's been quite a bit of psychological research on this, that some people are innately, this is 50% heritable, 50% genetic. Some people are innately positive about these kinds of changes, and some are negative about, they see these changes as loss, and they see diversity and difference as disorder. So you're getting a very sort of split reaction to these sorts of changes, and that's feeding a lot of the political divides that we're seeing. And then once you get a reaction to those changes on the populist right, if you like, that then leads to a counter reaction on the sort of identity left, and then you're into a sort of second tier moral polarization layered in on top of the polarizing reaction to the changes. So it's sort of it's definitely a recipe for a totally new kind of politics.
Emma, carrying on from Eric's point there, I remember that when the point was made about London being minority white British for the first time, there was this, I think it was on Newsnight, the point was, well, does this matter? This point was, does this matter? All I can say is that for a lot of people who watch our channel, but I suspect also not just who watch the channel, I think, yeah, it matters a lot, I mean, what's your view on it? Do you think, because if this was any other country in the world, wouldn't it be a cause for some concern?
Yeah, I remember going to a talk on the Pew statistics. I think they were from 2015 or 16 on demographic changes and religious change, and the panel was it was completely unanimous in its agreement that this change was a good thing. And I think, to pick up on Eric's point about people innately, I guess you would say, feeling particular attachments and not being comfortable with change, I think what's missing in the public debate is the sympathy for that perspective, and the immediate assumption that way of thinking is irrational or in some way immoral. And I think that we would limit the sort of potential for, as Eric was saying, these particularly polarizing populist movements if we were to give those views a fair hearing, because they are rational. And I think people really do feel a sense of loss, and they don't necessarily feel a sense of loss because they're racist or xenophobic or prejudiced against the incomers, but because they see the disruption of their own communities. And people develop bonds over years and over generations with their neighbours in particular areas. And I think the metropolitan elite within London don't realise that, because they are a transient population themselves. They are the anywheres of
Yes.
David Goodhart. And so I don't think that they really fully understand the perspective of people who feel so much of an attachment to place and to the population in that place, not on the grounds of ethnicity, but like Eric was saying, on the grounds of a shared history. And I think, as we were saying about as populations change and people intermarry, the particularly anti-British sentiment that is developing within certain aspects of our culture, I think I'm interested to see, whether people would choose to identify themselves with that history or with the history of the non-white parent, for example, because British history is being seen as something that's toxic. And in that case, you kind of lose that shared foundation, that sort of shared civic attachment that would create a more cohesive community.
Yes, the point really is absolutely right. But when people do talk, of course, this is a good thing. Huge change, huge ethnic change. This seems to be something that characterizes the discussion of this thing in the West, and I would say in kind of the self-hating West. Otherwise, I mean, would India have a discussion like this? Would Russia? Would Saudi Arabia? Eric?
Well, there are countries that, they're much more blunt about this in other places. In most cases, in South Africa, you'd have pogroms black on black pogroms. But what I would say is that there is a lack of nuance in this entire debate over ethnic change, because the view is you're either open or closed. So it's not a debate about faster or slower. You're either open to change or you're closed to change. If you don't like the speed of change, then you're closed to change. And similarly with the idea of majority ethnicity, you're either someone who wants some sort of white pure ethno state and no more change, or you are open. So it's sort of taking complexity, collapsing it into a black and white dichotomy is the way in which we're having this discussion. Instead of saying some people want it slower, some want it faster, maybe we need to slow it down to allow for intermarriage and identity shift to occur. And then, if you want, perhaps we'll be comfortable with a speeded up. that sort of nuance, or maybe there's an optimal level of diversity, not too much, not too little. No, I mean, you cannot say there is too much diversity or you are again in that closed bad category. So there is just a complete shutdown in logic when we discuss this. I mean, part of this is about a lack of understanding of the psychology, which is again well established in the literature, that attachment to is not the same as dislike of. So, if I'm really attached to my family, that doesn't make me any more disliking of the neighbors than if I'm not attached to my family.
Yeah.
And that's shown in study after study. So yeah, you can be attached to your ethnic group, to the character of your neighborhood, etc. If it's changing, you don't like that, it's mainly due to a loss of something you feel you've lost in terms of attachment to, rather than hatred of. And I think those two are collapsed together as well. And that's also a big problem. And I don't know how we get past this in the current moment.
I think David Goodhart wrote a brave article for Prospect, suggesting there might be too much diversity a few years ago. What his views are now, I don't know.
But the thing is with that, actually, he did indeed and got into a lot of trouble for it as well, I think, David. But I mean, I think the point really is that when there is what I think is called or was called super diversity, it leads to a breakdown in all sorts of social bonds, such as trust, amongst not just inter-group, but actually within different groups. It public volunteering, for example, becomes less. All of those sort of things tend to happen when you have that much diversity. Can I ask? I mean, again, you mentioned David Goodhart there. Christopher Caldwell wrote a book about 15 years ago called Reflections on the Revolution in Europe, which was basically saying, can Europe be the same with different people in it? I mean, something that Eric alluded to earlier, which is that this is seen by most people as a cultural thing, something the elites simply don't understand. They always see it in economic terms. Do you think, David, that Europe can be the same but with different people in it?
I can just about imagine that it could be. Sometimes I listen to people from of Asian or African or some other kind of background on the radio, and I think what admirable people these are. They're cleverer than I am. They speak English better than I do. If I were blind, I wouldn't be able to tell what ethnic group they belong to, which was different from my own. So on those occasions, I feel rather optimistic that it wouldn't matter. But those individuals are, I think, only a relatively small minority of the overall, an educated minority of the ethnic group populations, and there are others, particularly from South Asian Muslim backgrounds, who are very keen to remain together and who do not wish to embrace, or at least many of whom do not wish to embrace Western attitudes from the point of view of tolerance, sexual equality, and all the rest. That they're happy to lead a life, as it were, in first world safety, security, and health, but one in a much more traditional cultural world.
But that has huge implications, doesn't it, Amra?
Yeah, I think that probably the situation has become a lot more complicated since that book was written, partly because obviously we're talking about concern about cultural change as generations come and go, and the population is substantially diverse from various different countries, and that it doesn't really have much continuity with the culture that came before. But I think what we're now seeing with this new left or left modernism that Eric mentioned earlier, I think that has complicated the situation because there isn't very much continuity between that, which is becoming a very prevailing culture amongst particular segments of society, particularly influential segments of society. There isn't much continuity between that and what came before. And I think that discourse makes it much more difficult to even discuss any of these issues. And so, yeah, I think that has muddied the water a lot, because it's a culture that's being taken on by also the white British population in various ways, and is kind of seeping into to the broader culture. And so I think it's just more complicated than it was previously.
Yes, it's sort of it's very interesting, because the fact is something that David mentioned there, that the idea was somehow that huge diversity would make society very, very open. But the fact is that at least the European experience of it has meant that many of the groups coming are socially very, very conservative or religious, and that's had a different effect. Eric, has it not?
Yeah, I mean, I myself am less concerned about some of the values, the challenge to Western values, that sort of discourse. I think there may be some of that, but I think that ultimately, you'll probably get, individualism and capitalism and democracy will roll on somehow. But I think it's much more about this idea of the narrative of a people being continued, the traditions, the memories, the folk ways that are in some way connected to ancestry. And so if you have a substantial part of the population that traces their ancestry and collective memories to another part of the world, then that's simply going to mean a less distinctive society, and a lot of what we would call the everyday markers of nationhood, the folkways and the memories and traditions would tend to erode. Now, of course, you're always going to have super diversity in the cities and a certain space for the cosmopolitan to exist. It's a question of balance, and I just feel that that's not where we are. There is no balance. It's really only one is good and the other is the bad old monocultural past. So how we get back into some kind of respect for the ethnic majority and its tradition, and now it's an assimilative ethnic majority, but it's currently not got any real respect in the high culture. Instead, it's completely dominated by the left modernist ideal where diversity is the highest goal. How we get out of that cul-de-sac, I'm not quite sure. I think it's going to be a bit of a battle.
Yes, and in that context...
Sorry, David, yes.
Sorry. In that context, I'm wondering whether the word English or England would go out with the population. It's clear that people who come from all sorts of backgrounds may be happy to call themselves British, either British straightforward or British hyphenated, Black British, Asian British, whatever. There's a much greater reluctance to call themselves English, and I would guess a greater reluctance on the part of those who can logically claim English ancestry to regard them as English. And it may be that word will become less and less used as time goes on. As the white British or white English populations retreat to the suburbs and then to the country, and as some have suggested in rather a fantastical view of the future, retreat into the status of the hobbits in Tolkien's book, where when in the future they are going to be a small secretive group of people seldom seen and seldom heard.
I think that's also that's spurred on by this, you mentioned earlier, the sort of self-hatred. If you look at what's going on at the moment with various councils and the public space, they want the public space to respect what they say are the values of the council, the values that we now hold, and they're the values of diversity. And so I think that attitude that has obviously become much more prevalent since the Black Lives Matter protests, and the attitude that we have and that we teach towards our history, I think that is also accelerating people's reluctance to identify with those memories that Eric mentioned, and will disrupt the continuity even if the population didn't change so rapidly, because I think people are very, it's almost fashionable to disassociate yourself as much as possible. So even if you look at like the recent Adam Curtis documentary, the way that Adam Curtis, it's a a huge hugely popular documentary series, the way that he portrays English folk culture, or even the desire to try and preserve folk culture, he portrays that as almost as if it's fascist to try and preserve it, that as if there's something wrong and dark about those things. And so I think that that cultural aspect will also have a seriously important impact in that sort of continuity of collective memory and how we choose to identify ourselves.
I know something that rather chimes with this is my own parents tended to refer to themselves as British until about the last 10 years of their life. And suddenly they started talking about themselves as being English. And it was very noticeable. And I think that has happened more when people feel that something is being lost, and also if anybody can be British, then almost like nobody is. But you are English. That was very clear to them what that meant.
But the only thing I would say, though, Peter, is that we're now seeing in the youngest members of say, South Asian groups, a slightly growing tendency to identify as English if they're in England.
Right.
I mean, it's not large, but it might be 20% or so, whereas the older generation, it would be in the small single digits. So I don't think it's inconceivable that English, too, could become a sort of more civic kind of identity, in which case the ethnic majority category would then retreat into something like in the US, where it's sort of white American, for example. But I think... I think the lack of sympathy for this group really goes back to the origins of left modernist ideology in the sort of 1910s, actually, in the U.S., when the Randolph Bourne and some of the Bohemian intellectuals who came up with these ideas really urged immigrants from, say, Jewish, Italian, and other immigrants to retain their culture. So they wanted preservation, but for the exotic immigrant cultures, and they urged the Anglo-Protestant majority of America to be cosmopolitan and to slough off its. So ethnicity is great for minorities and for immigrants. It's terrible for the majority. And that's a contradiction, this what I call asymmetrical multiculturalism. And so, for example, you will see in Canada, from where I'm from, for example, a complete romanticization of every myth and memory of, say, the Aboriginal peoples, of immigrant populations, and the complete opposite for any tradition of the kind of Anglo majority. And so this is sort of a standard contradiction that's embedded at the heart of this ideology, and there's really no way around it. I mean, you can't, and it's very interesting because I think there was a piece in the London Review of Books of some writer went out to the East End and found some fourth generation East End woman and was talking about it, and until she started talking about immigrants and loss. And suddenly he realized, and he admitted it, he realized that actually there's a contradiction in his belief system, which was about exoticizing authenticity, except when it's your own, and then you sort of reject it. Right? So it's kind of a really schizophrenic kind of ideology that we've arrived at. And I don't know how we get out of this, really.
I think it's that you could actually say that is almost, many people say that's the basis of multiculturalism, that actually multiculturalism was about celebrating almost any, culture, but not the host culture.
I think multiculturalism as well, though, I think it arose as a coping mechanism to deal with demographic change in the first place. And so in that sense, I think that perhaps that is one reason why the majority is kind of excluded from it. And now that we have all of these new ideas that basically believe that whiteness and anything Western or male is bad and evil or has the potential for violence, and the ideas of systemic whiteness and white supremacy being baked into the fabric of society, that's where things are at now. But I think that when multiculturalism first arose, it basically arose as a coping mechanism to deal with mass migration in the first place, as some kind of way of managing it because we didn't have the confidence to say you must integrate into the culture that is already here.
Well, actually, it's interesting. If you look at old newsreels from the first waves of immigration into Britain, they were remarkable, almost naively sweet and welcoming. There were these people telling the new immigrants, oh, these are our songs and this is how you sing them. And at the time, probably that was seen as terribly kind of, sort
exactly
of
what Meghan Markle wanted.
Yes, imperialistic and all the rest. But now you look back and you think, well, actually, they were trying to welcome. And also, this was sort of a way of kind of integrating. Just finally, I'd like to ask, what is the end game of this? I mean, when you say diversity is the main value, it's odd how diversity can be a value. It seems to me diversity is a thing. It's not a value as such. But anyway, they say diversity is the ultimate thing. When will we reach the point where everyone's happy? Or, what is the end point of diversity, David?
I think that boredom and annoyance may have something to do with this. You mentioned earlier on the role of Black Lives Matter in accelerating and accentuating racial consciousness and elevating the sin of racism to an even higher level of wickedness than previously it occupied, which I don't necessarily disagree with. On top of that, you got the Meghan and Harry business. And there's been, I think, a considerable backlash in Britain to that, partly as a consequence of what they themselves said, and partly because of the I think very unthinking endorsement, which many must have read about, from lots of people overseas, from the President of the United States downwards. And I wonder, in that context, if it's possible to reach, as it were, peak anti-racism, to reach a position where the positions adopted are so unsustainable and so absurd, so annoying, that they're a last-ditch successful rebellion, as it were, is possible in terms of the media and the things that people feel able to say.
Yeah, I mean, it's very interesting to see, of course, we look at the wokeness and the cancel culture and all these phenomena. My own view is that these attitudes have been there for decades in the high culture. And actually, what's new in some ways is the pushback. And we don't even realize it, maybe because we're part of it. But if you look at the number of organizations that have sprung up to oppose cancel culture, the Harper's Letter and the Heterodox Academy and Free Speech Union and the rise of this issue into politics in a way that wasn't as true of political correctness when it came on the scene in the early 1990s. It did not make its way into politics the way it's made its way into politics now, where you've got the Trump administration going after critical race theory. And that is now a major campaign at the state level. You've now got more attention being paid to media bias, to what's happening in the universities. This is now a major political issue, and I think it's only going to become a bigger political issue in a way that we haven't seen before. So I think we're headed for a greater politicization of these cultural issues, and only through that are we going to get back to some kind of sanity, I think.
Yes, well said.
Yeah,
on that,
I agree. It's bleak though, isn't it? We're going to have to walk through the fire to get to the other side.
Right. Well, on that note, look, thank you very, very much. Thank you, David. Thank you, Eric. Thank you very much, Emma. Don't forget to fill out your census form. I think that actually it's the 21st of March. It's when...
It is?
Yes, indeed, where you actually basically have to put down who is in your house at the time. So there we go. Anyway, this is a subject we will return to, certainly by the end of the year. Thank you very much indeed. Thank you.